They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices.
The highest court in the land just told the President of the United States that he was breaking the law, and he had been doing it for over a year. What followed in the next 24 hours was something no president had ever attempted before. And the question that nobody has yet answered is whether what comes next is legal at all. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States issued one of the most consequential rulings on executive power in modern American history. By a vote of 6-3, the justices ruled that the sweeping tariffs President Donald Trump imposed under a 1977 law providing him the authority to regulate commerce during national emergencies had exceeded the powers granted to him by Congress. It was the first major piece of Trump's second-term agenda to come squarely before the nation's highest court. And the court, shaped in part by 3 of Trump's own appointees, ruled against him. But what triggered this legal confrontation? It all began with a series of executive actions that reshaped American trade in ways no president had ever attempted before. To understand the full weight of what the Supreme Court decided, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment when the administration first reached for a law that was never designed for this purpose. Shortly after taking office in his second term, President Trump announced tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, citing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as his statutory authority. He then announced the Global Liberation Day tariffs in April 2025, also under IEEPA. The justification was twofold. One set of tariffs, known as the fentanyl tariffs, targeted America's 3 largest trading partners over drug trafficking claims. The other, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, were imposed because Trump determined that trade deficits had led to the hollowing out of the American manufacturing base and undermined critical supply chains. The scale of what followed was unprecedented. Trump imposed tariffs on imports from virtually every other country through a series of executive orders, with the tariffs being paid mostly by U.S. businesses. The United States Constitution explicitly grants the power to levy tariffs to Congress, not the executive. And IEEPA, the 1977 emergency law that Trump invoked as his authority, does not mention tariffs anywhere in its text. That omission would become the central legal fault line in the case that eventually reached the Supreme Court. But even as lawsuits multiplied and lower courts began ruling against the administration, the tariffs remained in place. The government collected the revenue. And by the time the Supreme Court issued its ruling, that revenue had grown to an extraordinary sum. The Tax Foundation estimates that more than $160 billion in tariffs had been collected under IEEPA through February 20th, 2026, and that over the next decade, the tariffs would have generated an estimated $1.4 trillion in revenue for the federal government. Those numbers are now at the center of a legal and financial reckoning that is only just beginning. The legal road that led to the Supreme Court's decision in February 2026 was not a sudden rupture. It was a deliberate, methodical progression through the American court system, one that gave the administration repeated opportunities to defend its position, and saw those defenses rejected at every stage. In May 2025, the United States Court of International Trade unanimously ruled that the president did not have the authority to use IEEPA to set tariffs in this way, and permanently enjoined the government from enforcing them. That ruling was upheld on appeal by the en banc Federal Circuit Appeals Court in August 2025. Both times, the lower courts stayed their injunctions, allowing the government to continue collecting tariffs while the administration prepared its appeal to the Supreme Court. The challengers who brought the case were not a coalition of large corporations or foreign governments. They were notably small businesses. The plaintiffs in the consolidated case known as Learning Resources, Income Reverse Trump, consisted of small businesses facing potential bankruptcy due to the tariffs, including companies selling educational toys, plumbing supplies, and women's cycling apparel. They were represented by the Liberty Justice Center, and their argument was focused and precise. The administration had improperly used IEEPA to impose tariffs that were not authorized by that law. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5, 2025. Court observers noted at the time that justices across the ideological spectrum expressed skepticism toward the government's position. Both Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett raised questions on the non-delegation principle, with Gorsuch warning that upholding the tariffs would create a one-way ratchet of congressional power to the president. The signal from the bench was unmistakable. The ruling, when it came, was not a surprise to those who had followed the arguments closely. It was, however, historic. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion in Learning Resources Inc. vs. Trump. He was joined by 5 other justices: Sonia Sotomayor, Eleanor Kagan, Neil Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. The vote was 6-3. Justices Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh, and Samuel Alito dissented. The court's answer to the central question was unambiguous. The President, Roberts wrote, asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth, history, and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it. IEEPA's grant of authority to regulate importation falls short. IEEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties. The legal reasoning at the heart of the majority opinion rests on a close reading of statutory text. The court scrutinized the provision of IEEPA that authorizes the President to investigate, block, regulate, direct, compel, nullify, void, prevent, or prohibit importation or exportation. The court observed that absent from this lengthy list of powers is any mention of tariffs or duties. The word regulate does not fill this void. The government could not identify a single statute in the US Code where the power to regulate includes the power to tax. That textual analysis was, in itself, decisive. But 3 justices in the majority, Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett, went further. They concluded that Trump's reliance on IEEPA to impose the tariffs violated the major questions doctrine, the principle that if Congress wants to delegate the power to make decisions of vast economic or political significance, it must do so clearly. That same doctrine was invoked in 2023 to strike down President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. It is now shaping the outer boundaries of executive authority in both directions. But what did the dissenters say? And why does their reasoning matter for what comes next? Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote the principal dissent, a substantial opinion running to 63 pages. Kavanaugh sharply criticized the majority's application of the major questions doctrine, arguing the court has never before applied that doctrine to a foreign affairs statute, where Congress traditionally grants the executive broad discretion. He also pointed to historical precedent, citing a 1976 Supreme Court case that unanimously held that a statute authorizing the president to adjust imports permitted the imposition of monetary duties. His argument was that Congress, when it enacted IEEPA in 1977, would clearly have understood the phrase regulate importation to include tariffs. Kavanaugh also noted, pointedly, that while he firmly disagreed with the court's holding, the decision might not substantially constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward, because numerous other federal statutes authorize the president to impose tariffs, including the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and several provisions of the Trade Act of 1974. That observation is not a footnote, it is a roadmap, and the administration immediately began following it. President Trump learned of the Supreme Court's ruling not in the Oval Office but in a private breakfast meeting with a group of state governors. He was reportedly handed a note while meeting with governors at the White House when he discovered the court's decision. Within hours, he was before cameras in the White House briefing room. His response was defiant and at points deeply unusual in its characterization of the nation's highest judicial body. Of the conservative justices who voted with the majority, including Chief Justice Roberts and 2 of his own nominees, Gorsuch and Barrett, Trump said they were just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and radical left Democrats. He called them very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. He reserved particular anger for the 2 justices he personally nominated in his first term. Trump said it was an embarrassment to their families, referring to Gorsuch and Barrett. He declined to say whether he regretted nominating them. Presidents have disagreed with Supreme Court rulings throughout American history. Criticism of individual decisions is not unprecedented, but the specific language Trump used to characterize sitting justices, including 2 he placed on the bench himself, was notable in its intensity and in what it suggested about the president's relationship with institutional norms of judicial independence. The administration did not, however, indicate any intent to defy the ruling. Trump's attention quickly turned to what came next. He declared that their decision is incorrect, but said it does not matter because we have very powerful alternatives. That claim of powerful alternatives would define the hours and days that followed. The administration's pivot from the invalidated IEEPA tariffs to new authorities was executed with speed that suggested substantial preparation. Within hours of the Supreme Court's ruling, President Trump issued an executive order revoking the IEEPA tariffs and, on the same day, issued a proclamation under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, imposing a 10% temporary import surcharge on products of all countries, effective February 24, 2026, for 150 days. That window, 150 days, runs to July 24, 2026. Then, the following day, Trump escalated further. In a Truth Social post, Trump announced he would increase the tariff from 10 to 15%, the highest rate allowed under Section 122, effective immediately. The question worth asking here is what Section 122 actually authorizes, and whether this new legal foundation is as solid as the administration is asserting. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 permits the President to impose a temporary import surcharge of up to 15% when he finds there are large and serious United States balance of payments deficits, or to prevent an imminent and significant depreciation of the dollar in foreign exchange markets. Crucially, Section 122 does not require the kind of prior investigations that other trade statutes demand, allowing the President to act fast. But it has never been used before. No president in the 50-plus years since the statute was enacted has invoked it, and economists have already questioned whether the legal predicate exists. Peter Berezin, chief global strategist at BCA Research, stated that a balance of payments deficit is not the same thing as a trade deficit. You cannot have a balance of payments deficit if you have a flexible exchange rate, as the United States currently does. That distinction is fundamental. The statute was designed for a fixed exchange rate era, a monetary environment the United States has not operated in for decades. Whether that legal challenge ultimately prevails in court remains to be seen. What is clear is that the new tariff regime faces its own legal vulnerability even as it is being implemented. The administration is not relying on Section 122 alone. Simultaneously, it has launched a broader effort to rebuild the tariff architecture on more durable legal foundations. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer announced the administration would open Section 301 investigations on most major trading partners on an accelerated timeframe. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows the government to investigate and impose tariffs on countries found to be engaging in unjustifiable or unreasonable trade practices that burden U.S. commerce. Those investigations take time and require documented findings. But they produce tariffs that, once completed, carry significant legal durability. The administration has also confirmed that tariffs imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, based on national security grounds, remain fully in force. Those Section 232 tariffs, covering steel, aluminum, automobiles, and other sectors, are estimated to raise $635 billion over the next decade and amount to an average tax increase of $400 per U.S. household in 2026. Beyond these well-known statutes, there is a Depression-era provision that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had flagged before the Supreme Court, ruling as a potential contingency. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 authorizes the President to impose tariffs of up to 50% on imports from countries that have discriminated against U.S. businesses, with no investigation required and no limit on duration. Those tariffs have never been imposed in the 90-plus years since the statute was written. They were used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations in the 1930s. The administration has signaled they remain on the table. The picture that emerges is of an executive branch working on multiple legal fronts simultaneously, constructing a new tariff architecture designed to generate revenue and trade leverage that approximates, as closely as possible, the scope of the IEEPA regime the court has now invalidated. The ruling that invalidated the IEEPA tariffs has opened a financial question with consequences that reach far beyond trade policy. The U.S. government could owe more than $175 billion in refunds to importers after the ruling, according to an estimate from the Penn-Wharton budget model at the University of Pennsylvania. That figure represents what has already been collected under the IEEPA tariffs declared unlawful by the Supreme Court. Hundreds of companies, including major retailers such as Costco, had already filed lawsuits seeking refunds even before the ruling came down. Following the decision, the pace of filings accelerated dramatically. The executive order revoking the IEEPA tariffs stated they shall no longer be in effect and shall no longer be collected as soon as practicable, but did not address the issue of refunds, leaving that to renewed proceedings before the U.S. Court of International Trade. The refund question is, in the words of Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, likely to be a mess. That characterization was drawn from admissions made at oral argument. The majority's opinion said nothing about refunds at all. The refund discussion is concentrated entirely in the dissent, and that itself is a measurable feature of the opinion. The court resolved the legal question of authority and left the remedial mechanics entirely to future proceedings. For importers, that means months of uncertainty, legal filings, and potential litigation before any money changes hands. The refunds that do get issued are expected to take 12 to 18 months to roll out, according to estimates from TD Securities. And there is a further complication. Many importers who paid those tariffs did not absorb the costs themselves. They passed them along to their customers in the form of higher prices. A Federal Reserve Bank of New York analysis found that U.S. businesses and consumers bore the brunt of Trump's tariffs in 2025, paying for nearly 90% of the levies. The question of whether a company that passed its tariff costs to consumers can still claim a full refund has no clear legal answer yet. Consumers who paid higher prices at the register are, by most legal assessments, unlikely to see any direct reimbursement. For many businesses, particularly smaller ones, the path to recovering what they paid will be neither quick nor straightforward. John Diamond, director of the Center for Tax and Budget Policy at Rice University, said that larger firms will likely recover more easily, while smaller firms are going to have a much more difficult time getting through the process. That asymmetry is itself a significant policy concern. The companies most likely to recover quickly are those with the resources to navigate complex legal processes, while the small businesses that brought the original lawsuit, the ones making educational toys and cycling apparel and wine imports, may wait the longest for relief. They argued they were owed from the beginning. The Supreme Court's ruling in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, is not simply a trade law decision. It is a statement about the constitutional architecture of American governance. It reasserts a boundary between the legislative and executive branches on one of the foundational powers in the Constitution, the power to tax. And it does so in a context where that boundary had been tested further and faster than at almost any point in modern American history. But it is important to be precise about what the ruling does and does not do. It does not end tariff policy. It does not prevent the president from pursuing aggressive trade measures. Legal experts at major trade firms have stated that they do not expect the Supreme Court's ruling to alter or materially diminish the president's current trade and tariff policy, given the range of other authorities available. What the ruling does is reinstate process as a requirement. It tells the executive branch that the power to impose sweeping, open-ended taxes on imports of any product from any country at any rate, for any duration, cannot be claimed through a single emergency declaration. It requires the president to work within statutory frameworks that Congress has actually established, through the procedures those frameworks specify. That means investigations before tariffs can be imposed under Section 301. That means national security findings for Section 232 duties. That means a 150-day limit and a congressional authorization requirement for Section 122 tariffs. Each of these constraints is real, and each one reinserts a degree of institutional deliberation into a policy process that, over the past year, had bypassed that deliberation almost entirely. Olu Sonola, head of U.S. economics at Fitch Ratings, described the ruling as removing more than 60% of the 2025 tariffs, mechanically dropping the U.S. effective tariff rate from about 13% to around 6%, and removing more than $200 billion in expected annual tariff collections. But he added that the bigger macro takeaway is not simply lower tariffs, but higher tariff regime uncertainty. That word, uncertainty, carries more weight in economic analysis than it might seem. When businesses cannot reliably predict what tariff rates will apply to their goods, their inputs, and their supply chains in 6 months' time, they cannot make rational, long-term investment decisions. The Budget Lab at Yale estimates that the current tariff regime increases the unemployment rate by 0.3 percentage points by the end of 2026, and that in the long run the US economy is persistently 0.1% smaller, the equivalent of about $30 billion annually in 2025 dollars. Tariffs, the analysis found, do generate modest long-run expansion in the manufacturing sector. But that expansion comes at the cost of contracting construction, mining, and agriculture. The net effect on the overall economy is negative. And these estimates, it should be noted, were produced before the new wave of legal uncertainty introduced by the court's ruling and the administration's pivot to untested statutory authorities. Internationally, the ruling has created ripple effects that are still being measured. William Bain, head of trade policy at the British Chamber of Commerce, said in a statement that the ruling does little to clear the murky waters for business, and that the new 15% global tariff imposed under Section 122 will be bad for trade, bad for US consumers and businesses, and weaken global economic growth. Countries that had negotiated individual trade agreements with the United States under the IEEPA framework now face uncertainty about whether those agreements remain in force and at what rates. The incentive structure for countries to continue negotiating with Washington has shifted. When the original IEEPA tariffs were in place, countries had strong reason to seek deals to reduce their exposure. Now, with those tariffs replaced by a flat 15% rate for 150 days, that urgency has diminished, at least temporarily. Canada's federal minister responsible for Canada-US trade welcomed the development. Canadian officials noted the ruling does not apply to the sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles and lumber, which are doing the most damage to Canadian trade. Those Section 232 tariffs remain in place regardless of the IEEPA decision. The relationship between the two countries over trade remains complex and contested, and the July 2026 USMCA review date looms as the next major pressure point on that front. The coming months will test a specific question that the Supreme Court's ruling leaves deliberately unanswered: whether the administration's alternative tariff framework can deliver the revenue, the leverage, and the trade policy outcomes that the administration intended when it first reached for IEEPA. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that the administration's alternative measures will result in virtually unchanged tariff revenue in 2026. That is an ambitious claim. It requires the 150-day Section 122 tariffs to remain legally intact against the legal challenges that economists and trade experts have already flagged as substantial. It requires the Section 301 investigations now underway to produce findings quickly enough to impose replacement tariffs before the Section 122 window closes, and it requires Congress to act if those investigations are not completed in time. None of these outcomes are certain. The midterm elections in November 2026 will be shaped in part by how ordinary Americans experience the tariff consequences that are still unfolding. Prices that rose during the IEEPA period have not automatically fallen simply because the legal basis for those tariffs has been invalidated. Companies such as Walmart have said they are maintaining higher prices because of the import duties, and analysts noted that any consumer looking for relief from tariff-driven price hikes did not find it at the Supreme Court. The refund process, when it eventually reaches importers, will largely benefit corporate importers rather than end consumers. And the new 15% Section 122 tariff maintains a baseline level of cost pressure on imported goods. What was promised as a mechanism for lowering prices through the leverage of tariffs has, in the view of many economists, produced the opposite. The political consequences of that outcome will take time to register fully, but they are coming. What the Supreme Court decided on February 20, 2026 in Learning Resources Inc. v. Trump is this: a law that authorizes the president to regulate importation does not authorize the president to tax importation. That distinction between regulation and taxation is not new. It is written into the architecture of the Constitution itself. Congress holds the power of the purse. It always has. What changes now is the practical implication of that principle for a president who has made tariffs the centerpiece of his economic and foreign policy agenda. The tools available to him are real, and they are not insignificant. Section 301, Section 232, and even the Depression-era Section 338 all offer pathways to maintain and potentially expand tariffs over time. But each pathway carries procedural requirements, legal constraints, and time limits that the IEEPA approach did not. The era of unlimited, immediate, open-ended tariffs imposed by executive declaration is over. What replaces it is more constrained, more contested, and more constitutionally grounded. The question of who ultimately pays the price, in dollars, in jobs, in trade relationships, and in constitutional accountability, is one that the courts, the Congress, and the American public are only beginning to answer.